Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick.
I'm Ian.
Today we're talking about 10 out of 10 albums from the 80s. There's a bunch of links down below. Make sure you check them out. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that we put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure to see a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time we release episodes. I think the first album that kind of came to my mind is an album that, I was never a huge fan of this artist. I think over the last probably 5 or 6 years, I've grown a bigger appreciation for his music, especially his earlier stuff. And that is American Fool by John Cougar Mellencamp. I guess he just goes by John Mellencamp now.
And just John Cougar back then, I think. There was a period of time because
he kind of went all over the place. It was because it's John Cougar on the front of it. If you look on the back of the album, it actually says John Cougar Mellencamp.
Right.
So,
and I know at one point it was just John Cougar, and then John Cougar Mellencamp, and then just John Mellencamp.
Yeah. But Jack and Diane was the big track off this album.
It hurts so good.
And yeah, that's another great one. But I think what makes this album so great are all the other tracks. Because you got those 2 huge tracks on this one. But there's not a bad one on this album. This album is, I think this is John Mellencamp's
Sgt. Pepper, as some people would refer to it as. Yeah.
I think it's the height of his career, even though it was early on. He would go on to do some other great albums. I don't think anything, at least in my opinion, lived up to the greatness on this album.
Well, and it's kind of, it was a staple of the 80s, because it was that period where, some of these artists were bringing in that kind of Americana element to rock. Mellencamp, Springsteen.
Yeah.
And I think Mellencamp did it better overall, in my opinion.
I don't know. Nebraska's a pretty damn good album.
Yeah, I suppose, but it's, I just feel like if someone put Born in the USA, Born in the US, yes.
Born in the USA.
Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And anything by Mellencamp, I'd probably go with Mellencamp, honestly. Yeah. And definitely this album over that one.
Yeah.
So the first one that I picked was Vivid by Living Colour. Everyone knows Cult to Personality. I mean, it was a huge song then. It's still a relatively big song. People know that song.
Yeah.
And it's oddly probably more relevant today than it was back then.
Yeah.
Maybe a little. But I feel like that kind of doesn't really give a clear indication of what this album is, because this album is really like everything in the kitchen sink and that makes it maybe sounds like it's a bad thing. It's not, because everything works on this album. But there's jazz, there's metal, there's punk, a little bit of punk in here.
Yeah.
Some Stones elements, because as it was produced by Mick Jagger.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing. And I didn't realize it was produced by Mick Jagger until several years ago when I picked up this copy. But I think going back and listening to this album, you could hear some Rolling Stones, especially some like mid to late 80s Rolling Stones influence on some of these tracks. But I love this album.
That, and I also want to point out, and I can't remember the guitarist's name, but the guitar solos on this album are some of the best guitar solos
of the 80s.
Yeah. For sure.
Another album that I think really kind of flew under the radar in the 80s, but kind of looking back on it, it's an album that inspired an entire decade worth of music. And that is Energy by Operation Ivy. This album, like I said, it was like going back and listening to it. It is a very kind of straightforward late 80s punk album, but it was the way that they influenced or pulled in influences from ska and some other areas of 80s music that really kind of helped forge this whole new kind of punk genre that would influence Green Day and a bunch of other bands in the 90s. And going back on here, you can go. This is the only album that Operation Ivy ever released. But going back through it, man, just like beginning end, there's not a bad track on here. It is just like the pinnacle, I think, of what late 80s, early 90s punk is and should have been.
So my next one's going to be one that probably is not really a surprise to anybody. Not just for me recommending it, but because of how big the album was in the late 80s. And it's Full Moon Fever by Tom Petty. I don't know what I could really say about this album other than it's a masterpiece.
It's just a perfect album.
It really is. It's and I didn't know this. I guess he claims this is the album he had the most fun recording ever.
Really?
Yep. And there's just,
I can say that because this was his first This was
solo album.
I think it was his first solo album, so I kind of understand.
Well, and a lot of this led into what became the Traveling Wilburys, which I love all that. It was actually kind of tough not to put their Volume 1 on my list for this, but I would say that this is a way more perfect album than even that is with all the talent there. But recording this is what led into that super group. And I think really this kind of is the transition for Tom Petty. This is the album that kind of defined Tom Petty's solo stuff, the Heartbreaker stuff going forward for pretty much the rest of the career. Yeah. You know, the much more kind of earthy, roots-oriented kind of music. And, I mean, there's not a bad song on this.
Absolutely not. Kind of along the same lines as Full Moon Fever. My next album is kind of the same way. It's kind of like when you think of this album, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. And it was also a hugely influential album in the middle part of the 80s. And that is Licensed to Ill by the Beastie Boys. You know, the funny thing is Beastie Boys started out their career as like this punk band and like transitioned into what they would become. And as much as I love Paul's Boutique and some of the other stuff that they would do in their career, I always go back to Licensed to Ill. This is, you know, I was probably like 7 years old when this album came out. So it's such a huge part of my youth, like forming my own musical interests and things like that. Maybe that's why I hold this album in such high regard, but you know, it's probably one of my top 10 or top 15 albums of all time.
See, for me, this album is always going to be intrinsically connected to Appetite for Destruction, because I guess it would probably have been maybe summer of '88 actually. For some reason, these two, I had both of these on cassette, and every night we'd play baseball in my backyard. Well, wiffle ball because we're kids, and we're close to houses. But we play wiffle ball, and we'd always have these two albums, Appetite for Destruction and Licensed to Ill, always playing. Yeah. I don't know why. Those just happened to be the albums that whole summer.
Two great albums.
Yeah, and it just kind of dominated that summer for me. Yeah. So my next one I don't have a copy of. Nick doesn't have a copy of it, so there'll be a picture somewhere.
Yeah, somewhere in this range,
general vicinity, maybe over my face. Who knows? It's Rio by Duran Duran. I'm not a huge Duran Duran fan, but as far as those early days of that synth new wave era, this was a hugely mainstream album. It's an album I can listen to all the way through. Yeah. And it's got a nice blend, because I've always said I don't have a problem with synth music, but it has to be balanced with real instruments and a nice song structure flow. This album has that. It's a nice blend. It's very synthy, but it also is very instrumental. There's real instruments going on there, and the songs are great. Very pop, but they're great. I probably couldn't tell you another Duran Duran album, honestly, other than maybe the one that just came out because it was all over the place. Yeah. I kind of wish
I've always loved Rio.
Yeah, I kind of wish that maybe they could still find a way. I don't want them to sound like they used to, but find a way, because I feel they've lost the balance. Yeah. Rio has all the balance it needs in terms of song structure, poppiness, synthness, new wave-ish. It really is. It's kind of a perfect album in that respect.
It all just works.
It does.
So the funny thing is about my last album is I was probably 10 years old. I think it was 10 years old when I first listened to this album, because Love Song came out on my 10th birthday. So I had to have been like shortly after that I listened to this album. I have absolutely loved this album ever since then. It's not my favorite album by The Cure, though, but it is a great album. I don't know if and my favorite album is Wish, but I don't think I'd put Wish as a 10 or a 10 out of 10 album. Disintegration absolutely is a 10 out of 10 album. This is one where, you know, it's got so many classic tracks on here outside of Love Song that, you know, I think would help to define The Cure and really kind of move their music forward. This was an evolution that, you know, with several albums coming. And then when they hit this, of course, they would go on to do some other great albums after this. But this is the one album I can go back through, even though as much as I love Wish, it's Disintegration, that beginning to end. There's not a bad track on here. You know, of the tracks on this album, I probably put 4 or 5 of them up as the top songs that The Cure ever wrote. Well, that's all we got for you guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop us a comment down below. Let us know what your favorite 10 out of 10 albums are from the 80s. This obviously could have been a much longer video. These are not like the end-all be-all list for us.
I had 10 just to start.
Yeah, that was the conversation starting point, I guess. Yeah. But let us know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure to give us the old thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all we got. Until next time.
Talk to y'all later.
Keep on spinning. Peace.